Or how will the questions be handled?
Yes, we'll do questions at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got it. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great.
Yes,
Thank
I can
you.
see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as Dr. Bruce said, we did a study together called The Effect of Common Core on fourth grade test results. And the purpose of this study is to determine if the adoption of the Common Core state standards for reading and mathematics in fourth grade actually had an effect on National Assessment of Educational Progress test scores. Our study extends from 2009, which is before the adoption of Common Core state standards, until 2019, which is after they had been adopted for a period of time. So for years, the average student test score, test results have been lower than what was considered proficient in core subject areas such as reading and math. And that is a problem for a number of reasons, two of which would be the fact that when we are compared to other countries, our test scores don't reflect or don't correspond to us being a world leader, and also the persistent achievement gap. Experts believed that students would perform significantly better if teachers were given standards regarding content to be taught. Previous to the standards, teachers primarily taught from the textbook, and as you know, the textbook, well, textbooks are different. So one may have, I don't know, 200 or 300 different concepts, which you can't cover all of them. And the other may have 50. And the one that may have hundreds of concepts, they don't necessarily go as deeply as they need to, where the students are really able to master the material. They're not able to grasp it as much. And so they call that a mile wide and an inch deep. So state standards were created in the 1990s, so that there were actually a set of standards that everyone in the state would adhere to. So during this time, each state set its own standards and accountability measures of what students were expected to know at each grade level. The statewide assessments were created to correspond to individual state standards, resulting in a lack of comparability for results across states. So in 2009, Common Core state standards began as an attempt to develop a nationwide set of standards and accountability for core subjects in elementary, middle, and high school. And the goal of the Common Core state standards and accountability was to develop college and career standards for K through 12 public schools in English language arts and mathematics. And this all started back really in the late 80s, early 90s, when business people and education experts, as well as government people, got together, and people from industry were complaining that students were coming out of school ill-prepared to work jobs. And so it's not just standards for college, but also career readiness as well. And so representatives from 48 states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia convened at a summit to launch the Common Core state standards in 2009. And they did that through the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association. So the significance of the study is that historically educational reforms have been implemented to improve student outcomes, and also that the Common Core State Standards Initiative was developed to standardize curriculum across the United States and improve student performance on high stakes testing. This study investigated whether Common Core improves student outcomes. And I'm saying that, I'm going to qualify that with the fact that in the past, prior initiatives did not meet expectations when they set these standards. Student performance did not, even though the standards were higher, student performance didn't necessarily go higher. The conceptual framework for the Common Core State Standards corresponds to the features of standards-based educational reform policies, features of standards-based educational reform that directly pertain to testing include academic expectations for students, alignment of concepts to help ensure objectives, usage of assessments of student achievement to measure outcomes as well. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bruce. I will stop sharing and she will share from here. Thank you. Dr. Bruce, you're muted.
Did we lose? Oh,
Okay, no, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, yes, thank you. I want to share about and mention Reardon's name because in part of doing the literature review, Reardon out of Stanford University, who's a sociologist, talked about the gap in standardized test scores between affluent and low-income students and talked about how it had grown about 40% since the 60s and now is doubled. The testing gap between African Americans and European Americans. And he discusses how wide that is. Now, while it has narrowed, it's still wide. Reardon also, and this is dated back in 2008, but still salient in our opinion, stated that the United States has moved from a society in the 1950s and 60s whereby race was a more important predictor of academic success than family income. In contrast, Tavernese talks about the 21st century family income, which we call socioeconomic status, appears to be now a greater contributor to educational success than race. So this is a shift as we can see. The methods that we used in this study, and we've specifically focused on fourth graders because the idea is if we can see as a result of using NAEP test, which is not a high stakes test, if we could look and see where the problem areas are with elementary students and begin intervening and trying to improve, whether it be via testing or whether it be through contextual methods used by educators. But to begin working on the areas where we see need proficiency, then something can be done to help students by the time they get to 8th grade. That was the rationale between focusing on reading and math with fourth graders instead of making this study start at 8th grade. Data were obtained again from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. For the purpose of this study, it was to compare scores before and after. So we wanted to see, a lot of studies have been done looking at Common Core, but we began to wonder, what if we looked at what was happening before Common Core? Granted, every state is doing their own thing, and that was the problem. There was no standardized test that we could look at nationally, and that was another goal of what NAEP was trying to do here. Um, and we wanted to see before and after Common Core. And so we were able to have a 10-year span to examine. So we called it Common Core versus not Common Core. In 2015, 40 states and Washington, D.C. were the states that had chosen to utilize Common Core, while there were 10 states that either chose not to adopt or not to participate for whatever reason. So there were 10 states that opted not to, and I know that Florida was one of those states that said, we don't want any parts of Common Core. The following charts reflect two groups that I'm about to show, two groups of schools, two groups of Common Core and then not Common Core. And in 2009, none of the schools had adopted Common Core. So I'd like you to look at this as base scores when you see 2009, because at this time, Common Core had not been implemented yet. It started in 2015, it was implemented because it started in 2010. So the purpose of the comparisons were to show the effects of Common Core on standardized scores between 2009, which was prior to Common Core, and 2019 is the latest data that we have, which is a 10-year span. And we call that after the adoption of Common Core. NAEP, it's usually referred to as NAEP, and it is a national assessment of educational progress. Measures academic progress nationwide for the fourth grade. It tests all curricular areas, with this study focusing on reading and math, while NAEP does test for science, social studies, and other subject matters. NAEP has a scale score of 0 to 500, and we looked at how NAEP divides their proficiency levels into 3 categories, and those 3 categories are advanced, proficient, and basic, with advanced being at the top and basic being at the lower level. So we will now present to you where this organization that we talked about at the beginning created cutoff scores. And these are, this is a chart of the cutoff scores and you can see that for reading and math, they are different cutoff scores. So advanced cutoff score would be 268, while math for advanced would be 285. When we looked at reading and thought about before and after, I'd like to say that the blue represents the states that adopted Common Core after 2009, and the red indicates the states that opted out of Common Core. The first 2 columns here show the difference in reading scores from 2009 to 2019. And as we can see, there's not a lot of difference. I'm going to go on, and when we look over here, this is not Common Core. And now I'd like to talk about before and after Common Core with fourth graders when we look at race and ethnicity. The blue column represents the Caucasian column, and In 2009, we had Common Core. In 2009, we have not Common Core. And when we say not Common Core, we're talking about those 10 states that opted out of Common Core. In 2019, we have Common Core. They actually use Common Core. So from 2009 to 2019, 10 years went by. And the difference that we can see here is from 204 to 202. And it's lower after being exposed to Common Core if we look at our African American children. Those that did not use Common Core, it wasn't so bad that they did not use Common Core for African American children. Remember, I talked about the Florida example. Florida opted out, and if they had remained in, their children would have possibly received 202. They opted out, they received 203. But what we do see as we look at this chart is a gap with Hispanic and Caucasian across the board, if whether it's Common Core or not Common Core. And what we also see is that whatever difference Common Core made, it wasn't a significant difference. So we talked about this socioeconomic status and it making a difference. And here we can see that whether it was before or after the use of Common Core, socioeconomic status was important. Not eligible for free and reduced lunch is what we call the higher earning parents and families, and eligible for free lunch would be the lower earning families. And we see that there is a gap with before, when there was Common Core, and when we look at Common Core afterwards, there's still a large gap, and we even see a decrease in the poor children's numbers after using Common Core. So I don't have to tell you that Common Core did not, this reform practice that was supposed to make a difference, it did not make the difference that the policymakers expected. When we look at math, Common Core, non-Common Core, you can see that the differences are very, very slim. Actually, I'll go to my findings slide, but I'll talk. This is the race. Again, we can see with mathematics, Caucasians leading, followed by Hispanics, followed by African American students, whether it's before or after Common Core. Our overall findings reveal that based on the analyses, differences in fourth grade reading and math were not materially affected by the adoption of Common Core. The scores typically did not vary by more than 2 points from 2009 to 2019 on each of the comparisons we examined. When comparing the mean scores to the cutoff scores, most were between basic and proficient. We did not see any that reached the advanced cutoff. So let's talk about this. Why do we continue to see the persistent gap? What can we do? Where do we go from here? We think that this funding issue continues to be an issue. Public school revenues differ from states. In most states, it's tied to local property taxes. Schools in affluent areas have higher property taxes, which provide greater local funding for public schools. This unequal funding is an issue. Schools in poor districts receive state funding, but the revenue they receive from local property taxes is not as high as the revenue received from the wealthier communities. So that lets us know that housing and segregation patterns is playing a role here with school funding. One recommendation that we offer, along with another, is that teachers and administrators need to continue to explore additional ways to measure proficiency. We talked about a group of policymakers got together, they determined cutoff scores, they determined what proficiency is. Is that the same thing that the majority of teachers might say proficiency is? So, this idea of proficiency, we argue, needs to be looked at deeper as it relates to meeting student learning outcomes. In conclusion, the results indicated that further research is needed to work with more early grades, and educators need to continue to find ways to intervene at the elementary level. But we want to close because prior to submitting this particular paper, I was listening to Prudence Carter, and she was talking about how complex of an issue this achievement gap is, and it's not a short-term fix problem. It's tied into elections, and it's actually a housing issue. Housing impacts public education, economics impacts public education, and also local schools districts impact education. And she called it a micro, a meso, and a macro level, that all of these different entities are intertwined in also affecting the achievement gap. And I'm not sure we've looked at it that way. We've been looking at test scores, but Prudence Carter says, let's look at the politics, the economics, and the housing, and see how that intersects with resolving the achievement gap for minority children. Thank you.
Thank you all for that informative paper. So is Ayana Ingram on? I didn't think I saw her. Okay. Christina Jones.
Yes, hello.
Hi. Okay. So if you want to share your screen to present, for some reason they kicked you out of the panel that I looked at today, but it's all good. You can still present for us. So go ahead, take over. I don't have the title, but you can take over.
Okay, so I have a team of colleagues, Kenneth, Taylor, Brittney, Venter, and Dana McCalla. And Kenneth will do the presentation, and then I'll just hop in if that's okay.
Cool.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for having us. My name is Kenneth Taylor. I am joined by wonderful colleagues who will introduce themselves. Our research project is titled The Impact of COVID-19 on the HBCU Community. I'm a third-year doctoral student at the School of Social Work, and I will let my colleagues, Christina Jones, Dana McCalla, and Brittney Venter quickly introduce themselves before we begin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Jones. I'm a master's student at Howard University, majoring in political science with a concentration of Black politics.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dana McCalla. I am a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard, and I am originally from New York, based in DC currently.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brittney Venter. I am a third-year doctoral student within the School of Social Work. I am originally from California, but now reside in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us.
Our presentation agenda will go as followed. I will start with the introduction. Our literature review will go into our project hypothesis and methods, our study population overview, dive into current trends that we found, and then discuss how we are continuing our research study and recruitment practices, and then questions and answers if we have time for that. So for the introduction, our team at Howard is concerned with the stories of HBCU students that were not being heard during the pandemic and the issues not being addressed either at the university level or the personal level. Our proposed study is designed to identify COVID-19 economic, social, emotional challenges students that are attending HBCUs have faced, the methods the students that the faculty and staff are using to address these problems, and then after identifying the problems, solutions that we can draft and present as policy and pragmatic recommendations to the university. For our literature review, college students' perceptions have been a subject of inquiry for researchers for many years. The research methods used in the student response survey portion of this study rely heavily on the perceptions of college students, which mirrored the works of Michael and Cochran, 2011, in their study on the effects of information on change in death penalty support. In this study, Michael and Cochran used convenience sampling as the main recruitment tool, and the goal of their research was assertion college students' perceptions of capital punishment. For the second component of our study, we utilized group methodology. We examined Lord, Ross, and Lepper's approach to the focus group data collection, as well as Williams, Longmore, and Gillick's 1988 study, which concludes that specific question wording used in opinion surveys, focus groups, and questionnaires are listed as a variety of responses. So utilizing the works of these notable contributions have been the guide to our current study framework. We will now be discussing our project hypotheses and methods.
All right, so in our project, we hypothesized that students attending HBCUs are more likely to be negatively affected by the pandemic than most other college students, as many HBCU students come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and may already face a number of constraints. When the shelter-in-place order was issued in March 2020, many students faced financial and logistical challenges relocating from university housing. Some returned to homes with limited quiet spaces to attend their virtual classes. Others returned home without dependable wireless connections or devices to use for class attendance. And the pandemic also impacted students in social and health-related ways. So considering all of this, we aim to achieve 4 goals with this study. 1, we aim to identify common and unique issues related to COVID-19 faced by African-American students enrolled at HBCUs. 2, we aim to describe methods being used by students attending HBCUs to confront these issues. 3, we aim to describe methods and programs being used by HBCUs to deal with immediate and long-term needs of students, both material and psychological. And 4, we aim to develop policy and programmatic recommendations for addressing issues that are related to the pandemic and the crises that disrupt operations of HBCUs. Next, we will go into our methods. So we will be using a mixed methods approach for this research, and we're combining quantitative data collection methods and qualitative data collection methods. For our quantitative component, we will be using a survey instrument via Qualtrics. And for our qualitative component, we are going to be conducting faculty focus groups. We believe that a mixed method approach will allow us to have a more robust understanding of the total impact of COVID-19 on our HBCU student and faculty target population. The 2 methods of recruitment being used in this study are convenience sampling and purposive sampling. As a team, we started with a convenience sampling approach, and we identified our personal contacts within the Howard University network. And then we employed a purposive sampling strategy by compiling a list of selected contacts at over 90 HBCUs. Professors and student leaders at these HBCUs are being contacted via email, and we've asked them to share the survey with their respective colleagues as well. The research team that's presenting today is an interdisciplinary team. We represent various fields within the social sciences, as we mentioned in our introductions. So we represent sociology, social work, and political science fields. And with that, each of us bring our unique perspectives and resources to this project. So I would now like to hand it over to my colleague to talk about the study population overview.
While trying to achieve an in-depth analysis of the unique ways in which students have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, the current responses within the Student Response Survey represent a dynamic demographics. Our inclusion criteria for the study consists of HBCU students who are 18 years of age or older. Currently, our respondents age range between 18 to 54 years of age. Women make up approximately 81% of respondents compared to 19% male, and graduate students make up 77% of respondents compared to 23% of undergraduate students. And thus far, the respondents represent 4 major institutions out of the 128 HBCU institutions, and they are Howard University, Morgan State University, Tennessee State, and Coppin State University. In the discussion of our trends, we will now discuss some of the COVID-19 related trends within 3 themes that we have identified for this study. And we will be looking for the financial, educational, and social emotional challenges of the students attending HBCUs, and those challenges that they're facing and that they've faced or presently facing. And now I'm going to pass this portion to my colleague, Dana McCalla.
Thank you, Christina. So as Christina mentioned, we have identified 3 themes in the data. First, I will cover the financial challenges. So we've selected 3 questions from our financial challenges section to identify just some trends that we've seen. And the questions that we've selected are: what was your employment status before and after the COVID-19 pandemic? How has your household income changed since March 1, 2020? And how have your job expectations changed as a result of the pandemic? So while analyzing the employment status of respondents before and during COVID-19, the trends reflected that there was no change in the employment status of participants who were employed part-time and who were doing work study. Participants who were working full-time reported a decrease in their full-time employment status from 32% to 22%, and the unemployment status of participants increased from 18% to 23%. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Data on the changes to participants' household income since March 1st, 2020 reflected a correlation between a loss of employment opportunities and a decrease in income. Over 50% of the respondents reported experiencing some form of income decrease, compared to 29% of the respondents who reported no change and 21% of respondents who experienced an income increase in some form. And then when examining this final question of how have your job expectations changed as a result of the pandemic, the responses from participants are mixed. Some examples we can see here are listed in this slide. I will just read out a few of the responses that the respondents have given us. One participant said that their expectations changed partially because of the trauma from racial unrest, health disparities, economic losses, as well as having to wear masks and trying to communicate, doing their job virtually, and then thinking about getting the vaccine and how that will impact the rest of the year and the rest of their year in different ways. Another respondent said, I doubt that the job market is enthusiastic about hiring virtual degree holders. Another respondent said that they expect more virtual opportunities. So now that we've analyzed some of the trends regarding financial challenges, we're going to transition into an analysis of our trends in our other 2 themes. So I will pass it over to Brittney.
Thank Thank you, colleague. So yes, now we're going to focus on some one of our other themes, educational challenges, and identify some of the trends that we've identified. So from our questionnaire, we've identified 5 questions that we wanted to focus on. The first one being, do you prefer in-person, virtual learning, or hybrid blend? We had 38% of participants saying they prefer in-person, 14% saying they prefer virtual, and 48% preferring the hybrid blend. Our next question, we asked, if all virtual, do you feel that you are receiving the same quality of education you would receive if in person? We have 27% saying yes and 62% saying no. Another question, are you satisfied with your online classes? 76% saying yes and 24% saying no, they are not satisfied with their classes. We also have some responses from participants that said that they're not satisfied with their online classes, and they shared some of their reasoning. A participant sharing, I learned better in person. Another participant saying lack of personable education and interaction with colleagues. Others stated, I believe that interpersonal communication is dampened and it is important for the learning process. Also suggesting that professors have zero patience when it comes to our technical issues. And another participant sharing, professors are less reasonable when it comes to different factors that may affect our assignments. Their unwillingness to adapt to this new change in lifestyle affects the way in which I learn because of their laziness. And then another question we identified, did you experience technology challenges at the start of the pandemic, meaning access to a device or reliable internet connection? We had 72% saying yes and 28% saying no. And next, the last question we identified for this section, have your grades suffered as a result of the pandemic? 32% saying yes and 68% saying no. So from these questions that we've identified within this theme, we noticed that there was just an overall lack of quality of education, people feeling like the need, this really yearning for the in-person interaction, having struggles with access to Wi-Fi technology was common, and just feeling overall just disconnected from content, feeling disconnected from interacting with professors. And just overall, majority of students prefer the option of having hybrid learning where they get a little bit of in-person interaction. So these are just some of the trends that we've noticed so far from the educational challenges. We're now going to talk about some trends we've noticed from social and emotional challenges. We've also identified 5 questions from our questionnaire. The first one being, how much has COVID-19 affected your life? We have 0% of our participants saying not at all, 20% saying moderately, and 80% saying significantly COVID-19 has affected their life. Our next question, since around March 1st, 2020, have you felt depressed? We had 96% of our participants saying that they felt depressed during this time since March 1st, 2020, and only 4% saying no. And our next question, since March 1st, 2020, have you felt nervous, anxious, or on edge? We have 92% of participants saying that they agree with this statement and they have felt those feelings, and only 8% that have not. The next question, since around March 1st, 2020, have you felt lonely? And we have 92% of participants saying yes, they have felt lonely, and only 8 saying that they don't. And then our last question, have any of your family or friends been victims of COVID-19? From our participants, 92% of them have agreed and said that they have had either been directly or indirectly affected by COVID-19, and only 8% saying that they haven't. From this particular theme, the trends that we've noticed is that this has affected our community very heavily. This pandemic, of course, has affected the world, but particularly our students. That an overwhelming 90%, more than 90% of our population have felt depressed. And with social isolation, we only know that that can be exacerbated during this time, and that how it could have such a lasting effect and kind of permeate to other parts of your life. So if I'm not able to show up in other parts of my life, then probably the last thing I'm worried about is my online classes. So this has just been really difficult for a lot of our community so far, but we're interested to see what the rest of our study shows. We're now going to go back to our colleague to talk about some of our continual studies. Thank you.
So, as we continue our recruitment for the study, we are seeking students who attend HBCUs and who are 18 years of age or older to gather information about their continued impact of the pandemic on their academic, emotional, financial aspects of their life. This is a two-part study. Today's presentation highlighted our preliminary findings from part 1 of the study, which is the student survey. Part 2 will evolve to the faculty focus group. If you have any further questions for us, or would like to participate as a faculty or student member, please email our team at covid19-gates@howard.edu. This will finally conclude our presentation. Thank you for having us and spending your time with us today.
Very, very, very good and informative. Thank you all. So one last try. Is Ayana Ingram on here? I don't think so. All right, so I am going to give some comments and feedback as the discussant, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. So I'll start in the order in which you all presented. And let me just first say that the Common Core paper is well-timed and much needed. So there are continual conversations about, of course, the best way to improve student achievement, especially in this sort of COVID environment and what COVID may or may not have done to student achievement. So I applaud you all on assessing Common Core in your research. So in reading the paper, I'm glad that I was able to see a little bit more in the presentation, because I did wonder about a little bit more about the findings that you all have. So one of the first things I would think in reading about the paper that you all might consider as you move forward is to think about the framing of the paper. The paper has a really good, rich discussion in the middle in the literature review about how income inequality has really become central to the differences in achievement. That is that low-income students have continued to fall further behind students with resources and to a greater extent than race. And so your findings, you show us racial differences, but the literature review really points out that that we even see these differences when we look at within the racial group. And so thinking about and expanding the conversation or even using that as the frame of the paper might be very useful to give the paper sort of a hook to explain, why you all are looking at Common Core, why you're talking about it, why people should care about student achievement before and after Common Core, especially as we see income inequality increase in this country. And so maybe thinking about using that frame, especially because we know that there's an increase in the percentage of low-income students who are scoring lower overall, even though we've seen lots of interventions, and Common Core is thought to be one of these interventions where we have a standardization process for performance, for curriculum to hopefully improve in performance. And we're seeing that it's not being an effective intervention as you show in your results. So that's one thought that came initially to my mind, is like this could use that low-income framework might be really, really helpful. The second thing that jumped out to me in terms of the findings is, did you all account for or think about looking at this at a lower level? So I know the NAEP scores are done at the state level. Is there a way to look at it within state to see how students are performing at a lower school district level? And the reason I ask is because while Common Core became sort of a fight and debate across states, we recognize that, really the differences are in school districts. So I'm here based in Atlanta, and in Atlanta, we have school districts that that are very different, right? So for example, Cobb County looks different from Fulton County. All of this is Metro Atlanta. And so while those differences might get lost in a state analysis. And so one thing you all might think about or consider, or even just explain why you haven't done it that way, is to have some discussion about breaking the findings down a little bit. And then the other thing that jumped out as I was listening to the presentation is just knowing a little bit more about the methodology and how you all went about comparing the findings and the outcomes and figuring out, being able to really attribute it to Common Core not being so effective. So is it Common Core, or for example, is it just the difference in the type of resources that schools have? And there is a rich discussion you have in your paper about resources that schools have in terms of the type of teachers that they have, the extracurricular and enrichment opportunities as well. And so just having a deeper discussion in the paper about the methodology that you all take to reach the conclusions would be helpful. But overall, I enjoy reading the paper, listening to the presentation, and seeing that despite, and with, I shouldn't say despite, maybe that's not the best word, but after all of the political debates about Common Core, because I do recall this being a really pressing and hot issue in the early part of the Obama administration, states have not benefited in the way that we hope they would have. So those are my comments and thoughts on that, and I welcome response as well. Do you all want to respond?
I think what I would I appreciate all of your feedback, and I have in another paper looked at Illinois in specific and school funding, the inequities of education. So I have looked at it at the district level, and found that that this socioeconomic status and property tax difference in areas, even though Title IX dollars are given to lower to poor school districts, it still doesn't compare to when parents are able to pay for Kumon and other additional, and what the findings were is that these wealthier parents are able to subsidize curricula. And so when we look at poor children not doing as well, that is playing a role in it as well, parent involvement and their ability to add additional things such as Kumon, Sylvan, and all of this with test preparation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And so being able to, account for that in the study that you all present would only make it better to say, even when we account for these differences, we see that the Common Core factor that is supposed to try to level the playing field, because we know those differences exist, is not doing its part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Karen, do you have anything?
This is great work.
Mine would have just been to add on to what you said, where we have seen that not even just the being able to pay for additional resources, which is what you mentioned, the types of tutoring, the types of resources in general, but even down to teachers with a certain amount of experience, 20 years of experience, 10 years of experience. If they are choosing schools, the trend is for them to go to the best school. When I say best, I'm saying schools where they feel as though they won't have to deal with as many discipline problems, where they feel as though they don't have to work as hard in order to get students on level, etc. And so schools in certain districts, based on income, many times get the less experienced teachers, and they tend to get teachers who many times nobody else wants. So that would just be to add on to what Dr. Bruce said. That's just one of the things, in addition to health issues, that students have to deal with asthma, an abundance of different other factors that actually end up playing into how they actually perform.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, all valid points, things I think, just clarifying that you all have accounted for those things to again say, when we even consider these differences, we are able to point to the fact that Common Core just isn't it. It would take the point home. So the second paper, this ongoing study that you all are doing is very, very interesting. And I'm happy to see that you all are taking on this task to figure out the effect of COVID-19 on the HBCU community. One of the biggest things I will encourage you all to do, and I know the focus is on the HBCU community, is to maybe consider a comparison group. So if your findings suggest that a lot of the things that that students on HBCU campuses have pointed out are things that we're hearing on PWI campuses as well. And so what you all might consider doing as you continue to build out your study is to look for some peer institutions that look similar to the weight places that you currently have, to be able to tease out and say, but here are some of the unique experiences of students of HBCU, right? And so having that comparison group will only strengthen your study to be able to say, for example, 80%, I can't remember the exact stat that you all showed, but like 80% of HBCU students said they had a feeling of depression, whereas students at PWIs, only 50% said that, right? That tells us a little bit more than without having that comparison group to say that we are seeing some differences, that there's a unique experience there. So I would encourage you guys to do that. And then the second thing that came to mind, you guys shared the questions that you all had, was like, often, right now there's a discussion about, why people go to HBCUs and HBCU pride. And so a lot of it is predicated on what do HBCUs bring and provide to students that other schools do not. And it's about things that the institution offers, right? The support systems, the culture, the community, the family-oriented feel, right? The rich history. And so this led me to think about, okay, what were institutions doing or not doing in response to COVID-19? And so that will also, thinking about the institutional aspect, would also probably help you all think about and frame your study as well on how the experiences have been different for students at HBCUs. Because really, those are the things that make going to an HBCU different from going to a PWI. So thinking about some of those institutional factors too, as you continue your study, and thinking about maybe that for your focus group part, could help enrich the study to say, these are the ways that it has affected HBCU students in a different and unique way than other populations. So I think this is going to be fascinating work, and I bid you well in doing, moving forward. But thank you all so much for sharing. So we have about 15 minutes to have discussion, ask more questions, if anyone has questions or want to respond as well.
Thank you.
I'd like to. Oh, was there someone else?
Sorry, I was just going to say thank you for the feedback. We definitely wrote that down, and we're going to consider that in our research moving forward. So we really appreciate it.
No problem. Go ahead, Dr. Bruce.
Yes, I would like some feedback from the participants as we look at education policy and notice how when a new president comes in, they label a reform No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top. We're not quite sure what President Biden is going to call his, but I think that one of the problems with trying to improve student outcomes deals with it being tied to different elections, and whatever the education director at the top plans to do, it has to be done within 4 years. Whatever school board members say they're going to do in their local district, there are election date timeframes impinging upon that initiative. So as educators and policymakers, how I want us to sort of just try to think outside the box, that how can we sort of pull education proficiency a little bit out of the way. We know that property taxing and these funding issues impinge upon it, yes, but it actually takes longer than 2 years or maybe 4 years to find out if, for example, starting students to go to school on Saturday. Let's just say that's the initiative that we're trying to see if that's going to increase proficiency. That would need to happen maybe for a period of 7 or 8 years and be evaluated on an annual basis in a systematic way. This is something that I see as a political scientist and a policy person that seems to be missing, and it has to deal with the political process impinging upon it. Okay, this didn't work, we got to try this. Like, yes, research has been done, the Common Core didn't work, but has enough time been done to try to really figure out how can we put these complex initiatives that Prudence Carter was kind of talking about? It takes kind of time to figure out what to do and then implement, and then have time go by of implementation time. And I guess I just want to put that out there on the floor because I think that's problematic with this education achievement gap. Yes, hi Albert, you have something?
Yes. Hey, my friend.
How you doing?
I'm fine. I guess the comment that I had, as it relates to Common Core, I mean, I'm not surprised that it made no difference. But my take on it is that I'm not necessarily convinced that it was intended to, because I think a lot of what's driving standards and specifically Common Core, there is a political push for just more privatization of public schools. The whole, a lot of this standards isn't necessarily about raising academic achievement necessarily, as creating a rationale for how bad the public schools are doing. And so if we can convince the public that the schools are a disaster, and that there's no alternative, then privatization, charterization is all the same agenda as far as I'm concerned. And we look at, so I think a lot of political motivations behind Common Core, and really this whole reform movement since the 1980s. I think a lot of this has been driven by politics more than anything else. And what got them into trouble was that they reviewed their game too much with Common Core. Because as long as the focus on reform was targeted at those schools, those Black schools, that was white middle class folk, but they were cool with that. But Arne Duncan made a mistake of talking about these white suburban kids in suburban New York who thought their kids were smarter, but then Common Core came along and they were crying because they were failing the test, and then you had this backlash. So I think that a lot of this is driven by, I think talk a little more about, I think a lot of this is driven more by politics, and this has never been about education reform, education achievement, because we've known since the Coleman report about the link between educational inequality and student achievement. And America doesn't want to do that. We don't want to spend the money. We don't want to reallocate resources. So we'll focus on testing because that's easy and that's individualism. And then we can blame. And we can blame communities for not being smart enough. We can blame parents for not being responsible enough. And we don't have to change the structure.
Thank you. I think the conversation does need to move to this intersectionality of economics, politics, and that sort of, I think she's right on point with that meso, micro, macro. And that is where I would like to also take this work. And I thank you for that feedback, Albert.
other thoughts? I will say that yeah, the answer is yeah, politics, right? It's always been about politics. The question of whose politics, I think, is more interesting and more important. And so one of this is just my personal read and understanding of Common Core's weaknesses, and that is that um, Common Core education is a local level issue, right? And often when policy initiatives are coming from the federal government, there is pushback because this is the last space that local governments still feel like they have some sizable control and people want it there. And so when we're asking Common Core, in theory, should work, right? So if we are college professors and we're thinking we should have a standard that everybody learns, and so that if people are going to college, we know they have this standard and everybody's meeting this standard. In theory, that should work and that should be helpful. But at the same time, because you pointed out, it's politics and it's really local politics that's kind of pushing against this, then yes, it was not scaled to work because local politics was always going to push back against something like that. To add to your point about looking at an intersectional approach, or looking at the connections between education and housing and economic inequality, I think we've also already always been there because we look to education to be the society's solver of all ills, right? So we've been thinking about it in a different direction. We've always looked to education to solve everybody else's problems. So it's not, but we haven't given education what it needs to also solve those problems. And so yes, education's problems are rooted in housing and income inequality, and health policy. And it's because we've looked for education to do all of those things too. So I think making the proper investments is important, but realizing that if we do not make investments, broadly speaking, everywhere, then we are still affecting education, that one thing that we expect to fix everything too. Like your fixer can't fix it if you're not gonna give it the assistance to fix in other areas as well. So I think that person makes a really good, clear point about kind of what we already know, but we're just not willing to do.
And my concern is it's because of the time in the election cycle playing a role as well. It does take time to do those things, maybe more than 2 to 4 years of election cycles, and people making promises that only they can keep. They make promises that they can try to keep, and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that plays a role in it.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
election cycle, for sure. I mean, education is the one thing that, we all often always feel like we have a stake in, because we either have gone through it or we have our family members, our children are going through it. But then, for the everyday person, it's like, how much are you really listening to what President Biden says about education? Because you know that your local school board and your individual child's school has, more impact essentially over what goes on. So I think to some extent, yeah, the election cycle plays a role, but I would give the local politics and like how they're responding to that probably more weight in their politics and their cycle, greater weight than what's happening at the top for K through 12 education, at least.
Right. And I mean election cycles over local, state, and federal, not just federal. I'm talking the role of the election cycles, period. They're all making a promise as it pertains to education, and they're on timelines, and their timelines do not necessarily coincide with the time that it takes to make sure that a fourth grade or a fifth grade is proficient in their learning. That is, yeah.
I would say, I think I agree with that, and I would add to your point, then not only their timeline, but the superintendent's timeline, right? Because really, if that person can't turn a school district around, then their timeline could go from being can go really, really short, right? And then we're on to looking for the next person who can do something. And so just thinking about it from a public management perspective, maybe the superintendent's timeline maybe is probably equally important too, right? They only have a short window to do something.
Right. And your average superintendent stays in a school district about 5 years.
With that.
Yeah, they don't stay around long. They move from school district to school district.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And for principals, it's even shorter.
Yeah.
It's no more than about 2 years. So when you think of that kind of turnover, it makes things very difficult.
Yeah, it definitely creates a space of instability where the outcomes, the agency outcomes you never actually get, right? Because you're constantly dealing with the implications of constant turnover in the name of reform. But when you put it like that, the reform is just a revolving door of people, ideas, and talking points.
When I was a principal during the era of No Child Left Behind, we actually called it No Administrator Left Behind because of the same discussion that we're having now. So, no, I agree.
Well, anyone else have any questions, thoughts? We have about 4 minutes. They are adamant that we must end on time so that the next panel can take the Zoom spot.
One quick point is that comparisons, international comparisons, are oftentimes used, and I think weaponized, as a way of justifying why we need more testing, why we need more of these accountability measures. But that's a fact. The fallacy is that we're not measuring the same thing. It's the same thing. No countries in the world use testing the way we do. So we're not even measuring the same thing. Many countries don't test as many people as we do. So again, we're not measuring the same thing. But a bigger part, and we've already talked about this, a lot of our Western European countries do not tolerate nowhere near the level of economic inequality that we do. And so therefore, a lot of those international comparisons are really garbage. They're going to garbage. Probably the salient comparison is between Massachusetts, our highest SES state, and Europe. And on those measures, we are as good or better than a lot of European countries. So it's socioeconomic inequality more than any other factor. And it's our unwillingness to acknowledge that is why we continue to be going from regime to regime of various type of education reform madness and conspiracies.
On that note, thank you all. Thank you all for attending the panel. Thank you all for presenting some wonderful research presentations. And I look forward to seeing these studies in print and learning more.
Thank you for being a great moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. I did my best.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
To the Mecca. You guys did a great job.
Yes.
Thank you. I can't wait to see more of your research.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
The bluff.